Welcome to Mental Health Awareness Week. This year's theme around the country is anxiety and their associated disorders. I'll tell you a quick bit about us and then we'll get stuck into the subject matter. If you've not met us before, we're called Big Dog, Little Dog. You only really get it if you meet us in the flesh. I'm Kevin, I'm the big dog. There's Bob, the little one. How little is the little dog? He's a respectable 5'7". And I refer to myself as 5'20". Doesn't sound quite so odd as 6'8". We're a tiny little two-person social enterprise, met as rival chief execs of organisations that supported people with mental health issues, become friends, and at the grand old age of 50, we decided to quit the rat race and form BDLD. So we spend all of our time now delivering all kinds of training, thanks to this remote lark, all around the world. Mental health first aid included in that, and a particular expertise in suicide prevention, particular expertise around men's mental health as well. So enough about us, let's get stuck into the content. What are we looking at in this session? The lion's share of the session is looking at anxiety as a thing, not as a mental health disorder, but how it affects all of us. And you can see there what we're going to look at. But then I will swing it into part two, where we're going to see at what point might someone's anxiety cross the line to be classed as a mental health disorder? What are the main disorders? And some tips for supporting someone you might know who's living with an anxiety disorder. If you yourself are living with one, some tips you can use on yourself. So that's what we're looking at over the next 45 minutes. For the purpose of this session, I want you to think of our brains purely in two contexts. I want you to recognize there's a part of our brain that focuses on all the feelings that we experience. And there's another part of our brain that focuses on the thoughts that we have. And this is going to be really key for us in a little while, but I just want to set the scene early doors. Think of yourself as having an emotional brain and a thinking brain, please. Feelings versus rational. Okay, so what is anxiety? Let's get all specific now. Anxiety lives about here in your brain. You've got two almond-shaped parts of the brain called the left and right amygdala. And it's inside your amygdala that fear lives. Your amygdala are constantly scanning your horizon for anything that they consider to be a threat. And if they detect something that they think is a threat, they cause the release of three hormones into your bloodstream. Norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline, cortisol, I'm sure many of you have heard of, sometimes called the stress hormone, and adrenaline, which I'm sure we've all heard of. And in a short while, we'll see exactly what those three hormones do to us. But suffice to say that if we wanted to define anxiety, here's a handy way of thinking of it. Both a psychological and physical feeling when the amygdala picks up on something that it thinks is a threat. So anxiety in itself is not a mental health disorder. It's a normal, natural state of mind that can even save our lives. How does it feel? Well, let me just ask you for a moment. Think about, please, let's have a job interview that you were waiting to be called in for. Let's have a time when you received really bad news. And let's have a time when you were in personal danger. Just take a moment, please, to think in those three different scenarios, what went through your head? Because we often talk about anxiety as if it's an emotion. It's not. It's a state of mind that then leads to emotions and different thoughts and feelings. So anxiety can manifest in many different ways. And we'll revisit this slide in a little while. Now I want to take you to what's actually going on, the process of feeling anxious. And what you can see on screen now are the three most important words we're meeting today: triggers, meanings, reactions. Triggers, something that causes us to feel anxious. There are 4 types of triggers when you think about it. First of all, external trigger. When I'm faced with something, I might get anxious about it. Secondly, there might be a mental trigger. Something going on in my own mind might cause me to feel anxious. Thirdly, chemical triggers. And let's not just think about drugs and alcohol here. Some prescription medication can cause anxiety. Foodstuffs like caffeine and sugar can cause us to feel anxious. Finally, there can be physiological triggers, something going on within our body that can cause us to go into a state of anxiety. And here's how our doctor wants to explain those 3 big words. First of all, there's always a trigger for someone to feel anxious. Secondly, once we're faced with that trigger, we attach some form of meaning to that trigger. And notice what the doctor's saying there. No trigger makes everyone anxious. So if I was to suggest the trigger of jumping out of an aeroplane, for many of us, the meaning we would attach to that would be absolutely terrifying. Yet some people pay to do it. And this is really crucial. The meaning we attach to the trigger leads to whether we feel anxious or not. And for those strange people that enjoy skydiving, they'll actually get some positive reactions out of doing that, where the rest of us will feel dread and doom. So we encounter a trigger, we attach meaning to it, that leads to our reaction. That's the big point from today's webinar. But let's focus in now on what we mean by meaning. And I've given a definition here for you to consider. So this is that massive point I want to make. You and I could encounter exactly the same trigger, yet depending on the meaning we attach to that trigger, we might be scared by it, we might be excited by it, we might be ambivalent to it. So the meaning is crucial in understanding whether we feel anxious or not. But we don't always know why we're feeling anxious. I'm sure we've all experienced feelings of feeling antsy, uptight, tense, but we haven't been able to put our finger on why. Those ghosts in the background going on. I'm going to get all posh now and quote Freud to you. Because Sigmund Freud, 108 years ago, came up with this theory about levels of consciousness. What Freud did is he suggested that there are 3 layers of consciousness. Notice there's the 10% above the water that everyone can see, 90% below it. So that first layer of consciousness is our conscious mind. This is where I'm sitting in your mind at the moment. You're fully aware that I'm here. I am in your moment. Think of this as the living room that we're sitting in. As we look around the room, we can take in everything that's in the room with us. That's our conscious mind. The second layer is the subconscious. And if the conscious is that front room that we're in, the subconscious is a room out the back, a storage room with a door wide open. And we can dip into our subconscious at will. If I was to ask you what you had for breakfast this morning, you're nipping in the back room, you're grabbing that memory, you're bringing it into your conscious. So although it's not with you in any given moment, you can easily tap into it. Then there's the third level, which Freud called the unconscious. And if the subconscious is that storage room out back with the door wide open, this is your basement with the door firmly padlocked. By definition, you can't access what's in here, but it's there. and it's been filling over your entire life. This is where you'll find that phrase we all hear, unconscious bias, which is the theory that deep down in this basement of ours, we favor some people over others. And we're completely unaware of them because they're in our unconscious. And the reason why this model is so important to us when we're thinking about meaning for anxiety is that meanings exist at all three of those levels. There's stuff in your mind right now from me asking you earlier to remember certain anxious moments that might still be sitting in your conscious. You've certainly got a lot of meanings in your subconscious. If I was to ask you, why do you get anxious about spiders? You might have a specific memory you can tell me about. But it's really important to accept that down in that unconscious, maybe buried in our psyche, we have meanings that we attach to certain triggers. That might be through adverse childhood experiences. So we've looked at triggers. We then attach meaning to it. That leads to the reactions. Let's come back to our three hormones from earlier. The amygdala has caused these to be released into our bloodstream. What do? Well, they carry out a number of functions, but there are two really relevant to us right now. The first thing they do is they act as something of an alarm system. Think about a time when you've received bad news and you felt the blood drain out of your face, you felt your stomach drop. This is your amygdala saying, "Oi, there's a threat and you need to do something about it." So it's a deliberately uncomfortable sensation to grab our attention. The second main function of these three hormones, for the next 10 or 15 minutes, they equip us with some short-term superpowers. We can run faster than we can normally run. We're stronger than we normally are. And I'm sure many of you are now thinking of that phrase, fight or flight. This is the amygdala saying there's a threat here, either take it on or run away from it. Hence what I said earlier, anxiety, a normal, natural state of mind that in the right circumstance can actually save our lives. So now that we've looked at what anxiety is and those three crucial words, what can we do about it? I'm going to give you two sets of tips here on managing your anxiety, putting that big nasty dog on a leash. First of all, understand your triggers. I gave you Freud a bit earlier. Now I'm going to give you Sun Tzu, Chinese general from millennia ago. And this is from his book, The Art of War. And what I want you to take from that is this point here. You may not know the meaning that your unconscious has attached to that trigger, but you can figure out what the trigger is. So think of a time when you've been anxious, but you didn't know why. You can't figure out the why. It's unconscious. Figure out the trigger. And please remember from earlier, we saw that there are 4 types of triggers. So the first thing we can ask ourselves is around the external triggers. Is it something that I've seen, heard, smelt, tasted, touched? Is it something that I've interacted with external to me that's caused this feeling of anxiety? If the answer to that is no, then let's move across to those psychological triggers. Ask yourself, what have I been thinking? What memories have I been bringing up? How stressed am I at the moment? What feelings have I got going on in my mind at the moment? Because maybe we've created that anxiety state within ourselves just from what our mind is focused on. If there's no sign of anything there, you remember there were 3rd and 4th triggers. And those 3rd and 4th triggers were physiological and chemical triggers. So on the physiological side, do you have any kind of virus at the moment? Viruses can cause a state of anxiety. Some health conditions can cause anxiety. Classic example of this one is an overactive thyroid. Hyperthyroidism can directly lead to anxiety. And until I get my thyroid under control, that anxiety might be really hard to shift. Then there's chemical triggers. And I mentioned to you earlier, yes, drugs, alcohol, prescription medication. I want to come back to caffeine for a moment. Caffeine is a stimulant. So by design, it raises the central nervous system. Please be conscious of A, what effect caffeine has on you. It tends to affect different people in different ways. And B, how much caffeine you are consuming each day. The general consensus is that once you go beyond 400 milligrams of caffeine a day, you will feel the physical effects. So the general advice globally is stay under 300 milligrams. But I want to give a couple of warnings within that. Warning number one is some products contain more caffeine than you think they do. I'll give you classic examples of this. Decaffeinated products have lowered caffeine, but they're not caffeine-free. Any painkillers that contain caffeine typically have 65 milligrams of caffeine per tablet. And we don't take one tablet, do we? We take two. So that's 130 milligrams of caffeine. That's over a third of our recommended daily intake already. Second big thing I want to make you aware of. This was really interesting a couple of months ago. Which magazine decided to do some research into how much caffeine the main high street products had in them. Have a look at this. And remember, we should be staying below 300 milligrams a day. And there are two that I would hope particularly leap out at you here. First of all, if you go to Pret, their espresso has as much caffeine as a cappuccino. That one little cup of coffee has the same amount of caffeine as a drink over 10 times its size. But secondly, look at that Costa cappuccino. No doubt there'll be people here right now thinking, oh my God, I have that fairly regularly. So one cup of that and you're already over the recommended caffeine intake for the day. And that's without thinking about any chocolate you eat, any fizzy drinks you have, any painkillers you have, etc. So please do be mindful of your caffeine intake. And if this research interests you, I've created a short little link down the bottom there where you can have a read of it yourself. So tip one, see if you can identify what's triggering your anxiety. That way we can do something about managing our exposure to those triggers. Tip two, work with your iceberg. You may remember at the very beginning, I asked you to think about your brain as both the emotional brain and the thinking brain. And this is where it really kicks in its relevance. Our thinking, it affects our emotions. Even those unconscious emotions. We can't access the unconscious mind, but it is listening in. So the vast majority of treatment for anxiety disorders isn't medication. It's in how our conscious thoughts can influence our emotional state. Let me take you back to the iceberg. Clearly, all of our thinking exists at the conscious level. By definition, all of our thoughts are in our conscious mind. You may also be conscious of an emotion you're feeling at the moment. But we've also got emotions going on down below in the subconscious and in the unconscious. And they're the ones that we can't directly control. We need to find a way for our thinking to influence what's going on down there. So the overarching concept of managing your anxiety is to get those thoughts to be of the type of thought that will ultimately get rid of any unwanted emotions. That's the goal of so many of the talking therapy models. Come back to this from earlier, these manifestations, how anxiety feels to us. Well, if our thoughts can influence our emotions, maybe we can get rid of all those negative ones. Because there are some positive ones in there as well. And those top two, stress and fear, I'm sure you'd agree, if we can harness them correctly, maybe we can actually use those as motivators for us. So that's the goal, to use our thinking to influence the right emotional state that we want to have. Question is, how do we do that? And what we'll look at now is the model that cognitive behavioral therapy is based on. You've all heard of CBT. It works off of a model called the ABC. Let me show you this model briefly. The A, we have an activating event. What in this session we've been calling a trigger. Something happens to us. When that thing happens to us, B, we apply our beliefs and our thinking to it, i.e. we attach meaning to it. And as a result of those beliefs and thoughts, there are consequences. Our beliefs and our thoughts influence how we feel, and our beliefs and our thoughts influence what we then do. Remember, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It looks to change your cognitive behavior, the way you behave as a result of your thoughts. Let's see it in action. So let's imagine I'm in a fight. There's my activated event. Instinctively, I apply my beliefs and thoughts to it. And I think, I'm going to get hurt here. So how do I feel? Scared. What do I do about it? I run away. Activate an event. I apply my beliefs and thoughts. I feel and I act. Let's take a more everyday example of the ABC. My dream job has come up for grabs. And right now, I am sitting in the reception area waiting to be called in. We've all been there. But my thinking's really negative. As I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, if I mess up, I'm not going to get it. This chance isn't going to come up again. What effect is that going to have on my feelings? I'm going to get nervous. And on my performance, I'm not going to do well in interview. But if I rewound the clock back, and this time, whilst I'm waiting in reception, I'm thinking more positively, reminding myself of how I fit the job specification, reminding myself that my life doesn't depend on me getting this job, then maybe the emotional state I get will be far more positive, and as a result, the true me comes through. And guess what? I get the job. So that B is so important, how we apply the meaning to the trigger that we're encountering. Hopefully that helps in terms of anxiety as a thing. I'll now take you into part 2. Let's explore when anxiety crosses that line and can be classed as a disorder. And what we did at BDLD, we created a simple model to represent when anxiety becomes or can become a disorder. We created a pie with 3 slices on it, P, I, and E. So here's my P slice. If my anxiety is persistent, so when I get anxious, I find it really difficult to come out of that anxiety state. Mine might be classed as a mental health disorder. The I of my pie is irrational. If my amygdala is screaming out threat about something it really shouldn't be saying that about, it may be classed as a disorder. My E, excessive. If, when I get anxious, I feel it way out of proportion with what the actual level of threat is, it's more likely to be classed as a disorder. So any one or more of those three features, and it's more likely to be classed as a mental health disorder. There are a number of anxiety-based disorders, but let's meet the main ones. First up, mixed anxiety and depression. Someone with this disorder has some of the symptoms of an anxiety disorder, but not enough for a diagnosis, and some of the symptoms of depression, but not enough for a diagnosis. Next up, PTSD. You've all heard of post-traumatic stress disorder. The person's experienced a traumatic event, and now they get involuntary flashbacks to it. They relive the event, and when that happens, all the anxieties resurface. OCD, the most trivialized of the anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder. I have obsessive thoughts that something bad is going to happen unless I carry out my compulsive behavior. Panic disorder. When I get anxious, I'm highly likely to have a panic attack. Or I get unnaturally anxious about the thought of having a panic attack. Phobias. These aren't just excessive fears. These are irrational excessive fears. Now, it might not be that the thing I get anxious about, it's irrational. Spiders can bite. But the level of fear and when I'm triggered. So for instance, if I just hear the word spider and I get anxious, it's more likely to be classed as a phobia. Finally, generalized anxiety disorder. And as its name suggests, someone living with GAD gets anxious about everyday things, or maybe gets anxious regularly as a general feeling of unease, and they can't put their finger on why. They just know that they're in this anxious state more often than not. Now, if you're wondering about prevalence, how common are these? Here they are on a spectrum. So you can see that mixed anxiety and depression is the most common of the anxiety-based disorders. In fact, it's the most common mental health disorder in this country, more common than depression, followed by GAD, PTSD, phobias, and then the two rarest are OCD and panic disorder. Less than 1% of women meet the criteria for panic disorder, and around 0.5% of men meet the criteria. How does it feel to live with an anxiety-based disorder? Well, put yourself in these four scenarios for me for a moment, please. So imagine you're a passenger in this car. It's doing speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour. The driver doesn't seem to be very good at it, and you think they might have had a couple of drinks. Just imagine the thoughts and feelings you're having in this moment in that car. Or imagine being on this roller coaster. Look at the speed of the bends, the speed of the decline, the speed of the ride in general, and being flung about all over the place. What kind of thoughts and feelings might you be experiencing in this moment? Or imagine facing your greatest fear. You know what your greatest fear is. Imagine it was right there in front of you right now. What kind of thoughts and feelings are you going to be experiencing? Finally, imagine if all the media channels started broadcasting that the world is about to end. What kind of thoughts and feelings might you be experiencing there? And someone living with an anxiety-based disorder may feel these kind of thoughts and feelings on a regular, even daily basis. So it can be extremely challenging living with an anxiety-based disorder. So I'll end the delivery part of the webinar with some tips for supporting someone or supporting yourself. And although I'm using ABC again, I'm going to give you them in different contexts. I'm going to give you 4 A tips, 4 B tips, and 4 C tips. So here's your A tips. First of all, please actively listen to the person. Give them the space to put their thoughts and emotions into words. Don't look to solve their problems, just listen. Allow silence. If you're asking me about how I'm feeling, if you're exploring my triggers and my meanings, I might need some time to really process it. You might be asking me questions that I've never looked to turn into words before. So give me that silence, please. If I'm worried, the sense of fear that my safety is at risk and it's not, reassure me of that. Make sure that I can see that I'm actually in a wholly safe environment. And what do we mean by aid recovery? Really encourage people to engage with professional support. The most common way that people deal with anxiety disorders is to avoid their triggers. And that's not fair. Why should we have to start changing our life? So encourage them to engage in the process, please. 4 B tips for you. Be available, be there, ready to chat if they want, but also be calm and reassuring. Your calmness can be infectious. And that's particularly important if you're supporting someone who's having a panic attack. Be calm, let the calmness spread. Now, I say bring empathy. Empathy is about having that connection and validating. You may not be able to empathize with their triggers and meanings. You may not be able to understand, for instance, I had a learner a couple of years ago who had a phobia of ladybirds. You may not be able to understand why a ladybird would make someone terrified. So always look to empathize with their emotions, please. And every emotion they might experience, you've experienced in your life. Final one on the B's, be vigilant. Keep an eye out for whether you think someone might be experiencing an episode of anxiety, experiencing a panic attack. And if you do, encourage them to open up to you. 4 C's for you. If the situation they're in, there is a risk, see what you can do to make them safe in that moment. Normalize the conversation. Let's have open chats with each other about what's going on in our mind, what's worrying us. Challenge the beliefs and thoughts. So if in conversation you find someone is automatically negatively looking at their trigger, ask them questions that might get them challenging their own way of thinking on it. Because we saw earlier, the meaning is everything when it comes to anxiety. What do we mean by cap and cope? Help them to cap their anxiety. In that moment when they are experiencing peak anxiety, help them to control it, to come out of a panic state. But also, coming back to where I started, help them cope. Help them understand what services are available, what services they're eligible for, whether that's through the NHS, an employee assistance program, a charity, a peer group. Really help them find out what support they can access. Okay, before I go to any questions, I just want to wrap up this part and then I'll stop the recording as well. There's our social media tags down there if you feel at all inclined following this. But let me also please blatantly plug the fact that we created a supplementary video for this and published it on YouTube this morning. So if you feel like it, it's a 12.5-minute clip that really takes today's webinar and moves it up a level. Starts looking at these things called ants that are the root of anxiety and examines what we can do to think more objectively in the moment so that we can control those emotions and avoid anxiety where appropriate. And you'll see in the top right-hand corner, I've created a short little URL that you can go to if you want to watch that video. So on that note, I will now stop the screen share. I will stop the recording and we'll turn to any questions that you might have.